What if one of the most debated voices in Scripture wasn't confusing at all, but misunderstood? Because Paul didn't come to remove obedience, he came to expose what it had become. In a world built on performance, he introduced something that sounded dangerous: freedom. Not freedom to ignore truth, but freedom from the idea that you could earn it. And that changes everything. Because if righteousness isn't achieved, then what is it? And if grace is real, then why does transformation still matter? This isn't just about theology. It's about the difference between maintaining something that looks right and being connected to what actually gives life. Because once that becomes clear, the question isn't just what did Paul mean? It's what is shaping the way you live. The tension we thought we understood. There are few names in Scripture that carry as much weight and as much confusion as Paul. For some, his words feel like clarity. For others, they feel complicated, even contradictory. And for many, they've become something we repeat without fully understanding. I remember the first time something didn't quite sit right. It wasn't a loud contradiction. It wasn't something obvious. It was quieter than that. Subtle. The kind of tension you almost ignore, because everything around it feels familiar enough to trust. Paul said things that sounded freeing, almost too freeing. He spoke about grace in a way that seemed to loosen the grip of everything I thought I understood about obedience, about law, about what it meant to actually follow God. And if I'm honest, part of me didn't know what to do with that. Because I had been taught to value structure, to respect boundaries, to see faith as something that was demonstrated through consistency, discipline, and doing what was right. But then Paul's words would show up, and they didn't always fit neatly into that framework. He would say things like, we are no longer under the law, that righteousness doesn't come through what we do, that grace isn't something we earn, it's something we receive. And the question started forming, whether I wanted it to or not. What did he mean by that? Because if taken at face value, it almost sounded like the rules didn't matter anymore. Like obedience had somehow been replaced. Like something foundational had shifted in a way that didn't quite line up with everything else I had been taught. And that's where the tension begins to grow. Not because Paul is unclear, but because we're trying to read him through assumptions we've already built. There's a difference between something being complicated and something being misunderstood. And what if the issue has never been Paul's message? What if the issue has been the lens we've used to interpret it? That possibility is uncomfortable, because it means the confusion doesn't come from the text. It comes from us. And if that's true, then the question isn't just about what Paul wrote. It's about what we've done with it. There's a moment when you start to realize that something familiar might not be fully understood. Not wrong, not completely off, but incomplete in a way that quietly shapes everything built on top of it. And when that realization begins to settle in, it doesn't stay theoretical for long. It becomes personal. Because Paul wasn't writing abstract theology disconnected from real life. He was addressing real people, real struggles, real misunderstandings about what it meant to live in alignment with God. And the more you sit with his words, the harder it becomes to keep them at a distance. They start pressing in, challenging assumptions, reframing what obedience actually looks like. And maybe the most unsettling part of all is the possibility that what we've called clarity might actually be oversimplification, that what we've called balance might be avoidance, and that what we've confidently believed might still need to be examined. So the question isn't just whether Paul was misunderstood, it's whether we've been reading him in a way that keeps us comfortable, because if his most radical teaching has been softened, reinterpreted, or quietly adjusted to fit what we already believe, then what we've been holding on to might not be the full picture. And if that's true, then understanding Paul isn't just about getting the theology right. It's about recognizing what his message was actually pointing to. and what that means for how we live now. When obedience becomes something else. There's a tension in Paul's writing that doesn't come from confusion. It comes from collision. A collision between what people believed obedience looked like and what it was always meant to be. It's not a small difference. It's a shift that touches identity, purpose, and how people understand their relationship with God. I didn't realize how deep this went until I stopped trying to make everything fit neatly into the framework I already understood. Because at some point, you begin to notice that Paul isn't just explaining ideas. He's confronting systems. Systems that were built over time, reinforced by tradition and trusted because they felt familiar and stable. Those systems gave people something to hold on to. They defined what it meant to be right, what it meant to belong, and what it meant to be faithful. But Paul doesn't come in and gently adjust those systems. He disrupts them in a way that forces people to reconsider what they've always assumed was correct. He speaks into a world where righteousness had become closely tied to performance, where identity was reinforced through visible obedience, where the law had become more than a guide. It had become a measuring stick. And into that environment, he introduces something that sounds almost dangerous if it's misunderstood. He introduces freedom. Not freedom as rebellion or disregard, but freedom from the belief that your standing with God is built on what you can achieve. That idea alone begins to unravel everything people had learned to depend on. Because if righteousness isn't something you earn, then what is it? If the law doesn't justify you, then what role does it play? And if grace is truly sufficient, then what does obedience even look like in a life that is no longer driven by performance? These aren't theoretical questions. They press into something deeply personal, because they challenge the way people measure their own faith, their own growth, and their own sense of alignment with God. Paul begins to reframe the role of the law, not as something that saves, but as something that reveals, something that exposes, instructs, and points, but ultimately cannot transform the heart. It means that external alignment is not the same as internal transformation. And that's where the tension becomes harder to ignore. It's easier to measure what can be seen. It's easier to define what can be tracked. It's easier to build a version of faith that feels structured and clear, even if it quietly drifts from what it was meant to produce. But Paul keeps pulling the focus back to something deeper. Not behavior first, but identity. Not performance, but transformation. And that shift changes not just how people act, but why they act at all. That's where one of the most misunderstood ideas begins to surface. Grace doesn't remove the call to live differently. It changes the reason you do. It moves obedience away from obligation and into alignment, away from pressure and into transformation. And that shift is easy to agree with in theory, but much harder to live out. Because it removes the safety of checking boxes. It removes the illusion that doing the right things automatically means being aligned. And it replaces it with a question that is far more personal. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Is it driven by fear? By habit? By expectation? Or is it flowing from something that has actually been changed within me? That question doesn't leave much room for surface-level answers. And maybe that's why Paul's words have been softened over time. Because if taken seriously, they don't just adjust theology. They confront posture. They challenge the idea that faith is about maintaining a system, and instead point towards something alive, something active, something that cannot be reduced to rules, but also cannot exist without real change. And that's where the tension in Paul's message actually lives. Not on one side or the other, but in the space where both are held together. If we miss that, we don't just misunderstand a few verses, we misunderstand the foundation of what he was trying to reveal. When the structure still stands but the meaning shifts. There are moments in Scripture that don't just explain truth, they reveal it through contrast, not by telling you what's wrong, but by showing you what has been quietly replaced over time. I didn't fully understand Paul until I stopped reading him as someone simply teaching ideas, and started seeing him as someone exposing something much deeper. Because the more you sit with his words, the more it becomes clear that he isn't just building theology. He's uncovering a shift that had already taken place beneath the surface. It wasn't something sudden or obvious. It didn't arrive all at once. In fact, it likely started with good intentions. That's what makes it so difficult to recognize. Because the structure was still there. The language hadn't changed. The practices continued. Everything looked familiar enough to feel trustworthy. But the meaning had shifted. And Paul keeps bringing attention back to that reality. He speaks about people who are zealous for God, yet not aligned with what God is actually doing. That's not an accusation of rebellion. It's something far more subtle. It's a misalignment that can exist even when the desire to do what is right is still present. That realization carries weight, because it means that passion alone isn't proof of alignment. Effort alone isn't evidence of truth. Even sincerity, as meaningful as it is, does not guarantee clarity. There is a moment when that begins to settle in, and it forces a question that most people don't naturally want to ask. What if something can look completely right and still be pointing in the wrong direction? That possibility doesn't feel comfortable, because it challenges the assumption that consistency equals correctness. Paul doesn't move around that tension. He steps directly into it. He describes a kind of righteousness that people tried to establish on their own. Not out of rejection, but out of misunderstanding. That distinction matters because it shows that the issue wasn't turning away from God. It was misunderstanding how God was working. And that kind of problem is much harder to see. It's easy to recognize something that is clearly wrong. It's much harder to recognize something that feels right, but is rooted in the wrong source. That's where Paul begins to shift the focus again. Not just what people are doing, but what those actions are connected to. Because when something becomes disconnected from its source, it can still function for a while. It can still look active. It can still appear meaningful. From a distance, it may not seem like anything is wrong. But eventually something begins to feel off. Like a branch that has been cut but still holds its leaves for a time. It still looks alive, but it's no longer connected to what gives it life. That image began to reshape how I understood everything Paul was saying. Because it revealed that the issue wasn't just behavior. It was connection. Connection to the source. Connection to what actually gives life. And without that, even the right actions can become empty over time. That's a difficult truth to sit with, because it means we can do the right things for the wrong reasons. We can maintain structure while losing substance. We can protect what we've built, without realizing that what we're protecting has already drifted from its original purpose. Paul doesn't leave that idea abstract. He brings it into something even more personal. He talks about transformation not as something external, but as something internal. Something that doesn't begin with behavior, but produces it. And that changes everything. Because it means the goal isn't to perform differently. It's to become different. It means the focus shifts from maintaining an appearance to being genuinely transformed from within. And that's where the symbolic weight of his message really begins to land. It exposes the difference between something that is being maintained and something that is actually alive. Once you begin to see that difference, it becomes difficult to ignore. It starts to show up in how we define faith, how we measure growth, and how we determine whether something is truly working. And the question begins to shift again. Not just what am I doing, but what is this connected to? Because if Paul is right, then everything depends on that connection. When understanding becomes personal, there comes a point where something stops being theoretical, where it no longer sits at a distance as something to study or consider. It begins to press in, asking to be recognized not just as truth, but as something that affects how we actually live. I didn't expect this to become personal for a long time. It felt like something I could think about without letting it touch anything deeper. It was a question rooted in history, shaped by context, connected to a world that felt far removed from the one I wake up in every day. It was something to understand, not something that required a response. But the more I sat with it, the more something unsettling began to surface. This wasn't just about them. It wasn't just about how people misunderstood Paul in the past. It was about something that still exists now. Something that can quietly take shape even in places where the intention is good. Because the same shift Paul was addressing then has a way of repeating itself. The movement from purpose to precision, from meaning to maintenance, from something alive to something carefully managed. It doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't announce itself as a problem. It forms gradually, often unnoticed, until what was meant to bring life begins to feel like something that must be preserved at all costs. And that's where the weight of this begins to land. Because it forces a question that is no longer theoretical. It moves past what we believe and into how we live. It asks whether what we're holding on to is still connected to what it was originally meant to produce. There is a tendency to prioritize what feels structured over what is actually needed, to hold on to what is clearly defined, even when it begins to stand in the way of what is right, not out of rebellion, but out of a desire to be consistent, to be careful, to be faithful. But somewhere in that process, something can begin to shift. The focus moves away from purpose and toward preservation, from transformation and toward maintenance. And once that happens, it becomes possible to protect something so carefully that it loses the very thing that made it meaningful to begin with. That realization is difficult, because it doesn't come with obvious signs. Everything can still look right on the surface. The language is still there. The structure is still intact. The practices are still being carried out. But something underneath begins to feel disconnected. Like the motion is still happening, but the life behind it is no longer as present as it once was. And if we're honest, that's not just something we see in others. It's something we have to be willing to recognize in ourselves, because it raises a question that doesn't allow for easy answers. Are we holding on to something because it is true, or because it is familiar? Are we maintaining something because it produces life, or because it gives us a sense of control? That question has a way of exposing more than we expect. It moves past surface-level alignment and begins to uncover what is actually driving our decisions. Whether what we call obedience is rooted in transformation, or whether it has quietly become something we manage and maintain. And this is where Paul's message becomes more than something to interpret. It becomes something to examine. Not just what we believe, but why we believe it. Not just what we practice, when truth demands a response. There comes a moment when understanding is no longer enough. When something that once felt like insight begins to feel like responsibility. Not because it was forced, but because it became clear. There is a difference between seeing something and responding to it. For a while, it's possible to recognize truth without letting it change anything. You can acknowledge it, even agree with it, while still holding on to the patterns that feel familiar and safe. But eventually, clarity has a way of pressing in, and it begins to ask something deeper. Not just whether we understand, but whether we are willing to respond. That's where this conversation about Paul stops being theoretical once and for all. Because if his message has been misunderstood, then correcting that misunderstanding isn't just about getting the theology right. It's about recognizing what that message was meant to produce in the first place. A life that is not built on performance, not sustained by maintaining appearances, and not driven by fear of getting it wrong. It's a life that is actually transformed. That idea sounds simple, but it's not easy. Because it requires letting go of something that often feels secure. It requires releasing the belief that control equals faithfulness. It means stepping away from the comfort of clearly defined systems and into something more relational, more dynamic, and far more personal. And that's where resistance often shows up. Not because the truth isn't clear, but because the shift feels costly. There is a kind of safety in knowing exactly what is expected, in being able to measure where you stand, and in having a framework that tells you with certainty whether you are doing enough. But Paul's message doesn't leave room for that kind of certainty. It replaces it with something deeper, something that cannot be reduced to checklists, something that requires ongoing alignment rather than occasional adjustment, a kind of life that can't be managed from a distance, but must be lived from within. And that brings the question back, one last time. Not just was Paul misunderstood, but have we been holding on to a version of his message that allows us to stay comfortable? Because it is possible to agree with the idea of grace, while still living as if everything depends on performance. It is possible to talk about transformation, while still relying on structure to define where we stand. And that tension doesn't resolve itself. It has to be confronted. Not with pressure, but with honesty. Not with fear, but with clarity. Because the goal was never to remove obedience. It was to restore it to its source. To move it out of obligation and into alignment. To shift it from something we manage into something that flows from who we are becoming. And that changes everything. Because once obedience is rooted in transformation, it no longer feels like something we are trying to maintain. It becomes something that reflects what is actually happening within us. And that is what Paul was pointing to all along. Not a rejection of truth, not a loosening of what matters, but a return to what gives it life. So the question that remains isn't complicated, but it is personal. What is shaping the way you live? Is it structure or transformation? Is it habit or alignment? Is it something you are maintaining or something that is actually alive? Because the answer to that question doesn't just define how you understand Paul. It defines how you live.